Welcome all friends here and also on the internet. Thank you for joining us today. Today is Halloween. So we are going to talk about the hierarchy of celestial beings, which is said to exist almost by every religious or spiritual tradition. You know, when talking about the universe, there are like three main theories, we could say. There are many, but these are the main ones. One is the idea that there is a creator, God, in different names, in different cultures, and he's a pure spirit, therefore he's perfect, and he created the world out of nothing. So this is known as creationism. In science, they say, well, there is no reason why we should believe that there is a God or anything that is not perceptible through our senses, because we can explain the universe without saying that there has to exist something beyond what we measure. That is not really true. The universe cannot be explained in the most fundamental things, and neither can life or any fundamental process in the universe. But anyway, the scientific point of view is that the universe is just like a machine. It runs without a particular purpose, without a particular intelligence behind, and it just runs based on mechanical laws and pretty much based on random reactions. You know, the wonderful working of our body, with each cell doing an enormous amount of activities coordinated, they say it's just the product of random motions within the cells, that the proteins and everything is bouncing from here to there and it happens to fall into the right place. So it's very unlikely. Actually, if you do the math, statistically speaking, it's impossible to explain anything that is important in the universe. How life began, or how our bodies work, not even how a bacteria works. You know, we haven't been able to create a computer model for a bacteria, which is the simplest of the organisms that we know, because it's so complex. And this is why people that are proposing the third option, the option of the intelligent design, this is the argument that they use to say that the scientific approach is flawed. Because they say, you know, to try to explain how life began by just random reactions, the odds for that to happen are the same as putting a monkey in front of a keyboard, and the monkey just randomly pressing the keys could write a sonnet by Shakespeare, for example, randomly. You know, you put the exact letters one after the other with no intelligence, just randomly. They calculated the odds, and they say that that's more or less the same odds, which is really difficult to calculate. But the point is, if you are going to be really accurate, you cannot posit that life began with no guidance. And actually, this is recognized by the scientists. In any classic biological or book on biology, you will say that they say, you know, the appearance of life on Earth, it's like a miracle, because the odds are so low. And I have a scientific background in especially molecular biology, and when I was giving my final examination in genetics, I discussed this with the chairman, the teacher, and we saw how, or I showed, you know, how the math don't work, and he said, yeah, that's perfectly fine, but unless you are able to measure and prove what the force that is guiding all this process is, then from the scientific point of view, it doesn't exist. You know, if you cannot measure it, it doesn't exist, scientifically speaking. And he's right, because that's the way science works. So we shouldn't take science as the last word on anything, neither science, philosophy, religion, or theosophy for that matter. But science has its own limitations. So there is this third approach that is the one of intelligent design. Now the problem with this approach is that for the most part, it's a veiled way to present creationism. You know, it depends on who is presenting this idea. The idea of intelligent design is that there is evolution, there is growth in the universe and laws, but there is an intelligence behind. Because in creationism, they say there is no evolution. God created every creature as they are, and that's it. There is no change or growth or evolution. And when you ask them about the fossils and the dinosaurs, they will say, well, Satan put them there to test your faith. It's true. I had a person telling me that. So from their point of view, it's perfectly feasible. If you believe that Satan is there, if you believe that Satan wants you not to believe in God, I guess he could do it. But the intelligent design tried to come, you know, midway between the scientific approach and the religious creationism. Although many times, as I said, it's more a veiled creationism. Theosophy proposes an intelligent design model of the universe, and it has its own characteristics, and we are going to explore that tonight. The idea from the theosophical point of view is that intelligence is pervading the cosmos. Everywhere there is this idea of the universal mind. There is intelligence behind everything that happens. Now, when we say intelligence, we are not necessarily saying a human-like intelligence, like an entity that thinks, plans, tries to execute the plan. There is an intelligence that is impersonal. For example, we have a very apparent examples, things that are very easy to see, like, for example, the instinct in animals. You know, the definition of instinct is a knowledge that is not acquired. It's innate. And we see animals doing the most amazing things with what we call instinct. We don't know what it is, but we put a name and think that we already know it or that we explain it. But, you know, from a very simple fact, the turtles, that the babies are, you know, the eggs are on the beach, and then the mom goes away, and then when the egg hatches, all the babies run to the sea because you have there, you know, different birds that would eat them. How do they know that they have to run to the sea? You know, they are just out of the egg, and there is no way to explain how they know. Or other things, animals know. Yeah, inside the egg, probably maybe there are some instructions there, you know. Or things even more complex. I was reading about, there are some apes, or some scientists were watching a group of apes, and they saw that one of them grabbed a leaf of a plant that was bitter, the leaf was sharp and hard. It was a terrible thing to eat. And the ape just folded the leaf so that it would be eatable in a sense. He started eating it, and they say that the face that he was making when he was eating, is just like when you give a medicine to a kid. So that was what called their attention. First, that wasn't part of the diet, the normal diet, and then the face that he was making. So they studied they studied the leaf and what things had, you know, chemically speaking, and they saw that it has some molecules that would act against parasites. Actually, some of those molecules are used in medicine. And then when they research, those leaves are excreted almost whole and with a lot of parasites around. So how did he know? And there is a whole book about these things. Who taught this ape? Or there are some amazing things, and we call them instinct, and we say, okay, yeah, that's just instinct. But this is this universal mind, universal intelligence, that is working behind everything. Even our intelligence is nothing but the expression of the universal mind through our brain. There is one mind, one intelligence, expressing everything everywhere in nature. And it expresses in different ways according to the complexity of the organism. Of course, the plants have an intelligence. There are studies also about this. But of course, their intelligence is nothing when you compare it with the complexity in an animal or in a human being. Just because the organism of a plant is not complex enough to show very complex responses. But they even saw that minerals have some responses that are very similar to those in organic organisms. Like, for example, the fatigue that many minerals or metals suffer. I read several years ago a study that the pattern is exactly the same, the pattern of fatigue, as the one that we have in our muscles. So there is a parallel there. So the idea is that this intelligence and this life and this consciousness, if you want to call it, is everywhere, expressing in different ways. Actually, when we, even on the physical plane, without positing any celestial beings, even on the physical plane, when we try to see where life ends, it's very hard to tell. For example, 200 years ago, we thought, as scientists thought that fungus were the simplest form of life. Then with the microscope, they discovered the protists. These are like a bundle of cells, very, very, very minute organisms. Many of them are just a single cell. And they said, oh, okay, there is something that is simpler, that is alive, because these cells, they have their own organs. They are called, they are not like, they have their lungs and they have their hearts, of course, not in the form of the organ, but they have different, like we can say, bag of enzymes that perform those functions. So they saw that life goes even to the level of a cell, a single cell. But then they discovered the bacteria. The bacteria don't even have any organs. It's just like a soup of things there, and still they show an extraordinary intelligence and ability to do a lot of things. So then they say, okay, bacteria are also, living beings. Then we get to the virus. The virus is not even that. The virus is just a box of protein and some nucleic acid inside, DNA or RNA. And they just look like a crystal, but when they get into the cell, they take over and they can kill an organism. So they say, well, is this alive or not? It's like in the, the frontier. And they say, okay, as long as something has a replicative molecule like the DNA or RNA, it is alive. Now then we discover the prions. The prions are these, I don't know how to call them, they are just a protein, they are not microorganisms, that produce the mad cow disease. These are just proteins that they have a different form, and they travel through the body and touch other proteins and makes them look like they are. So they replicate and they produce all this illness. So these proteins, they are replicating themselves. So they are alive. So where are we stopping by saying something is alive or not? So Theosophy says everything is alive. Of course you won't expect a protein to have the intelligence of a human being, but they have their own intelligence. So the idea is that not only on the physical plane, but on subtler planes, we have seen in the previous talks how Theosophy says there are many dimensions in the universe, not only the physical one. There are non-physical dimensions that we could call an emotional plane. In Theosophy, we call them planes, usually. An emotional plane, a mental plane, and higher planes. And Theosophy says on all these planes, there are entities, there are beings, and they are intelligent. Now, you have this in all religions. They call them angels, or in Christianity, for example, or Elohims in Judaism, Devas in Hinduism, the gods and daemons in the Greeks. You have in every tradition, you have the idea of these non-physical beings. Now, the problem is that they are usually interpreted as being anthropomorphic. They are thought as human beings that are incorporeal, and they have an intelligence similar to ours. Well, that's not the theosophical view, and it's really difficult. The reason why science and Western philosophies tend to reject this idea is because of that point. It's very unlikely that there are these incorporeal beings and that they have an intelligence like human beings. But Blavatsky says in The Secret Doctrine that these beings are not endowed with a consciousness that has any relation to the one we conceive of. So the idea is there is intelligence, but don't think that it's the kind of intelligence or consciousness that we are used to. For example, an animal probably is not able to fully understand what kind of consciousness we have. In the same way, we are probably not able to fully understand what kind of consciousness these celestial beings have. There are degrees of consciousness and intelligence vary very widely. It is said that the highest of them are absolutely beyond our mind, are the conception of our mind. The lower beings are more similar to some human resemblance at this level. Now, the idea is that these beings are behind every law in the universe. So in Theosophy, laws are not just mechanical things. They are enacted by intelligent beings. This may sound difficult to understand, but actually we have a lot of examples on the physical plane that we can relate to. For example, before the bacteria were discovered, the idea when people saw how a piece of meat left outside would enter in this process of, decomposition, they would think that that was something mechanical. Even the illnesses, this theory of the miasma, the idea is that there was something inorganic, because they didn't know about the bacteria, that would produce this malfunctioning in the body. Now, if you study an illness, you can see they follow a law, they follow a pattern, very immutable in the same conditions. The same with rotten food. It follows a pattern. Now, then we saw, when we discovered the bacteria, that this pattern that looked very mechanical is actually mediated by entities, by the bacteria. You can say the same with anything else. The bees produce honey or help in the pollination, and they are conscious beings, but they act in a way that is predictable, and therefore laws can be easily thought of as being mediated by beings, as long as these beings act in a consistent way. Even human beings, that we all have our free will, when you see human beings from a statistical point of view, you can predict anything. You can predict how the elections are going to be. You can predict how they are going to act in the mass, when facing certain things. So there is a possibility of laws being actually mediated by intelligent beings, especially in the case of these celestial beings, because they don't have a consciousness like ours, in the sense of having a free will, as we think of free will. We make a big deal about free will, but actually free will is more of a weakness than a strength. Because you have to decide, free will in the sense of making a choice. I can make a choice. Yeah. Now, when you have to decide between A or B, and you think and you choose to do something, it is usually because you don't know what to do. So you have to think about it, and you have to weigh it, and you have to say, okay, what should I do? And finally you decide something. Now, if you were perfectly wise, and there is a situation, and you see immediately what the right thing to do is for your happiness and the happiness of the whole, you wouldn't need to choose anything. You just see the right thing and you do it. That doesn't mean you don't have intelligence, you don't have free will, you don't need to choose, because you know what the right thing is. So the idea with these celestial beings is that they don't have that problem about not being able to perceive what they should do. So they perceive it and they do it. Blavatsky says that each one of these beings, they have a limited field of action and responsibility. And they work within whatever they can perceive in particular. So that's why there is a hierarchy of beings. We have beings that have a wider role in the universe, and some other beings that have a smaller role according to their intelligence. She says, for example, that this hierarchy of spiritual beings is like a host, and they have limited freedom of action and limited responsibilities. Each are contained in a larger individuality to which its own interests are subservient. And each of them are containing lesser individualities in themselves. So the idea is like, we have the cells, ourselves. Little by little, science is discovering that the cells have their own kind of consciousness. They have their own memory. They have their own habits. They respond to the general law of our body and our consciousness, but they have also theirs. So this is something similar. We have wider beings. Within the field of consciousness of these beings, there are other celestial beings that they fulfill certain functions. This is why, for example, in the Kabbalah or alchemy, you hear about the nature spirits. Gnomes, fairies, undines, all these beings. And they say they help in the working of nature, the flowering, of a tree, in this, in that. And the idea, just as I was saying, just like the bees that help with the pollination, they also help with the flowering or with other functions in nature. Now, these nature spirits are the lowest rank of celestial beings. So they are, I'm going to talk briefly about some of the different levels, but they respond to a more general intelligence of a higher being that in which they are contained, and they have, in charge a certain group of plants or a certain kind of soil or whatever they do. So the idea in Theosophy is that everything that happens in the universe is mediated by intelligent beings, by living beings, because there is nothing that is not living. It's not a question that you have living and non-living. So naturally, everything happens through living beings. Now, again, the Theosophical concept of living being and conscious being has to be widened or is wider than our concept of what is alive. We wouldn't say that the table is alive. Theosophy would say, yeah, there is life there. Now, the life is so much in seed that we don't recognize it. But the same principle that is acting in the interaction between atoms, Theosophy says, with evolution, that principle becomes more and more complex, and it's the same principle that ends up being self-awareness. It's not different. If we could follow the evolution of this interaction between atoms, what they say, the adepts, those who can research into that, they say if you can follow it, you see that it's the same principle. So that's why there is life in minerals, but not life from a scientific point of view with the definition of the ability to reproduce itself, to have a metabolism, and blah, 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 whatever definition it is. So another characteristic of these celestial beings is that they don't have a sense of individual identity. We have this sense, I am Pablo and I am none of you. These beings are beyond that, or they have not yet developed that idea of individuality. So maybe it's similar, or we could use as a metaphor when you are in a choir. You are an individual being, but you are, thinking about the whole choir and how you fit there. And during your activity in a choir, or in a band, or in an orchestra, your whole being or your whole attention is about fitting with the whole. So probably they have a similar consciousness. They don't think of themselves as individuals. They are, Blavatsky says, their consciousness is the consciousness of the whole hierarchy. And when we see the writings of enlightened beings, they more or less talk about that. They transcended the idea of individuality. And although they have an individual experience of the universe, yet they don't have an individual sense of identity. These are two different things. But we cannot go into that now. We will touch on this in probably the next series. So finally, the idea is that since they don't have individuality and they are the embodiment of laws, Blavatsky says we cannot pray to them for personal favors. She says that these beings are the agents of the karmic and cosmic laws. To appeal to their protection is as foolish as to believe that their sympathy may be secured by any kind of propitiation, for they are, as much as man himself, the slaves and creatures of immutable karmic and cosmic law. So the idea is that it's not that we don't have interaction with these beings. We are constantly interacting with them. And as long as we work in a particular field, we have this interaction in that field. For example, if we do a healing activity, we invoke angels of healing. We try to work with them to send healing energy, and they respond to that. Or in a mass, angels are invoked, or in a Masonic or any other ritual, also entities are invoked, and they respond. There is a lot of information about this in regards to theurgy. Theurgy was a word that the Greeks used, especially the Neoplatonist Iamblichus, and he would talk how everything we do, even the normal things in our daily life, we are constantly interacting, invoking certain entities and all that. But what Blavatsky is saying here is that they will always act within the karmic laws and not to please our personal, desires. And that's very easy to understand. Imagine a football game, and the two fans, the fans of the two teams, they are all praying to God so that they can win. So who's going to answer to God? Well, maybe God, is fan of one of the teams. But we human beings ask for all kinds of things, contradictory, And it's very difficult to see how there could be a real response in that sense. Now, praying for strength and all that, it's many times, there are a lot of studies about this in esoteric philosophies. It's many times attuning ourselves with the universal principle of strength, so we actually stimulate strength in us or connect with this universal strength. But it's not that we call an angel that will give us strength. It's okay, you can use that image. It's perfectly fine. But it's good to know what is really happening. Whatever image we use is fine, it's just an image. But the idea is that they are not there to answer to our, whimsical desires. And this is the last thing that I wanted to say about this, and then we can see if there are any questions, and I will close with a brief description of different hierarchies. But the last idea that I wanted to share is that these beings that are working on all levels of the universe, they are not perfect. The idea of God is perfect, and there can be no mistakes, and therefore it is very difficult to explain many things in the universe. Blavatsky says nothing that is limited can be perfect. And all these beings have a kind of body. Remembering one of the previous talks, we said that spirit and matter appear in the universe at the same time. There is no matter without spirit. There is no spirit without matter. Whatever is without spirit or matter is above, beyond, and is neither of them. It's a synthesis that is beyond. So all these beings have a kind of matter or body, and therefore they are conditioned. So none of them is perfect, infallible. Blavatsky says actually there are mistakes in the process of developing of the universe, especially as we come lower on the planes, the entities are more and more limited. And she says that the process is not always perfect, and however many proofs it may exhibit of a guiding intelligence behind the veil, it still shows gaps and flaws, and even results very often in evident failures. So, according to Blavatsky, the extinction of some animals is just the result of failures in the entities that had to create them. There is a stanza in the Secret Doctrine that says that with nature she was referring to these nature spirits, to the lower beings that are taking care of the physical plane. She says nature, unaided by higher beings, fails. And she says the dinosaurs were like semi-intelligent attempts to create a body for the human spirit, but that didn't work. So they were, destroyed by nature. And then in the Secret Doctrine, it is said there came some other higher beings that helped nature to produce a form that was suitable for the human being. Whether this is actually true or is also part of a mythology to teach certain truth, we don't know. But the idea is that there are mistakes and there are corrections. She also says that at the beginning of the evolution, different species could have an offspring, something that now is not possible. And she says the primitive man that didn't have the mind awakened actually had intercourse with animals and produced some of the beasts that are there in the mythologies, half human, half animals. And she says this was a mistake. So then nature corrected that and put a barrier, now we would say a genetic barrier, so that the species cannot, intermix. So the universe that Blavatsky is postulating here is a learning universe, because every entity is growing, every entity is evolving. There is no entity that is already perfect. Perfection is in the absolute. So since the manifestation of the highest being down to us, we are all growing in skill and awareness, intelligence. And Blavatsky says, therefore, neither the collective host of beings nor any of the working powers individually are proper subjects for divine honors or worship. All are entitled to the grateful reverence of humanity, however. So the idea is, these celestial beings are not like our Father in heaven. We could look at them as our elder brothers. We can keep a sense of reverence to them, but it's not that they are perfect gods that we should worship. And she says, for an ant, human beings are gods. And probably she was talking metaphorically, but the ant, if we go and destroy the nest, the ant will say, it is we that we have sinned, and now we are being punished, and they would, worship us as gods when we are flawed. So the idea is that it's not to go to the extreme of the Gnostics. The Gnostics would say these celestial beings are the archons. They are flawed, evil. They are trying to keep us here imprisoned on earth. So you have to see them as demons more than angels. So Blavatsky said, she said, is there are inferior beings among these hosts, but they were never the devils or disobedient angels, for the simple reason that they are all governed by the law. So there are mistakes, there are things that go wrong, there is learning, but not this idea in theosophy of an evil angel or a perfect angel. So that's more or less a model of this intelligent and yet learning universe that theosophy presents. And we can open to some questions or comments, and if we have some time, I can give you some names of the different hierarchies. Otherwise, we'll see it in our next talk when talking about human evolution. Here, the mic.
Oh, come in.
Ed.
Who's got a question? Question? Anyone got a question? Oh, okay, here we go.
Okay. So, talking about these celestial beings, I think it's just a way of talking about things. I look at it like almost like a photon is. You could talk about it as a wave and demonstrate certain properties, or you could talk about it as a particle and demonstrate other. You could talk about it more easily in demonstrating other properties. Mm-hmm. So these are like personified laws, and when you talk about them as impersonal laws, that demonstrates one kind of property. By giving them being status, you could talk about, well, they're not perfect, because we know beings aren't perfect. Mm-hmm. You could either say both ways are correct, or you could say neither one really captures the whole truth, but is a way of talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is possible. Blavatsky made a lot of emphasis on the intelligent aspect of this, also because she was fighting against science. At the time, science was saying what I said at the beginning. We can explain the whole universe without the need of any intelligence. The universe is just a machine, like a clock, and it acts automatically. So Blavatsky made a lot of emphasis on the intelligent aspect of the beings. Now, on the lower levels, clairvoyants actually see beings embodying these laws. So there is probably a being aspect, but I would agree that there is also an impersonal, non-being aspect to this. Probably as we go higher, the being aspect is less and less prominent. But if we take into account their researches, they see entities and they can interact with entities. So at a certain level, there is a being aspect really there, really within the realm of illusion. But there is probably the other aspect also. Mm-hmm.
So we see people here. Mm-hmm. That's sort of the way our brain works, but there aren't really people here. There's just waves of quantum stuff going on mm-hmm. that our brain interprets as beings, and I think it's the same thing clairvoyantly. Yeah, in that from that perspective, I mean, I would totally agree. Everything in the realm of the manifested universe is just the imposition of an image on reality. So yeah.
Can you talk any more about Blavatsky's theory that the dinosaurs were a model for some sort of spiritual hierarchy for humans, or I don't know how to phrase that.
I can mention. The idea is, we are going to see this a little more next meeting, in our next talk, but the idea is that there is evolution going on 3 levels when we talk about human beings. There is the spiritual aspect evolving, there is an intellectual aspect evolving, and there is a physical aspect. So the spiritual aspect is like a witness watching the evolution of the physical organisms, waiting for the physical organism to be complex enough so that the spiritual aspect can begin to express through it. So, for example, if you put, in Theosophy, the divine spark in us is called a monad, from monas, which means one in Greek. So if you take the monad of any of us and put it in a plant, that monad cannot express more than as a plant because the organism cannot, doesn't allow more than that. So the idea is that the monad is waiting for the physical evolution to generate an organism that is complex enough so that it can express self-consciousness. Now, nature begins to build, as we know in science, from very simple organisms becoming more and more complex until it gets to the human being. This is another thing that science cannot explain. Why does nature work towards complexity? The more complex you make something, it's more difficult to keep it alive. It needs more things. The balancing of the body is extremely difficult. And bacteria are far more successful than we are in passing genes. Science says, well, everything is a question of passing genes. Well, no, because bacteria can pass genes in a far more successful way than human beings can. And they can live everywhere. In the North Pole, they can live in the geysers, or whatever you call them, these, really hot water, volcanoes. They live everywhere. So why would nature build anything more complex than bacteria? So the idea in Theosophy is that the complexity is being pushed by this other side of the universe, that is the need to develop consciousness. And in this process of developing a right physical form, nature, what Blavatsky says is, nature can create something up to the animal level. Something good up to the animal level. When it comes to an organism like the human being that can express self-consciousness, nature, the physical nature, needs the aid of a higher dimension of beings. So she says nature tried to build a physical body for human beings, and all it came to was like the dinosaurs or something like that. That wasn't good enough. So this idea, was even in several scientists in the 19th century. I think it was Lamarck who was one of the first proposals of a theory of evolution before Darwin. he said that there are, even Wallace. Wallace was contemporary with Darwin, and he proposed also a very similar theory of evolution at the same time. And he said there are certain things that cannot be explained by the idea of a progressive evolution. One is how we came from inorganic life to organic life. The other one is how we came from animal consciousness to human consciousness. And there was another one that I don't remember. So the idea is that he was saying, in these transitions, there is something else that is needed, something extra, not by regular physical development. So Blavatsky says, well, yeah, indeed there are some of these celestial beings that at a certain point, they come and help the framing of the physical body for human beings. So it's a very complex idea. I'm trying to summarize it, not very, very successfully.
Okay. And we have a question on the
Okay.
I'm not sure how to word it, but I'll make an attempt here. Intelligence also evolves. And so I'm thinking about the Atlantean when they had the huge human bodies. So if they evolve, if intelligence evolves, of course there are going to be certain errors, but I'm questioning, are there really errors? Because that was the intelligence at the time. And as intelligence evolves...
Yeah, I don't think we would say that that civilization was a mistake or an error, no. It's part of the growth, the evolution. I mean, this is in the context of, as I said, of a very complex anthropological theory that Blavatsky proposes with the idea of different cycles of human evolution. The previous one was the Atlantean cycle, which, by the way, not long ago, it seems that they discovered a sunken city close to Cuba with like a crystal pyramid and some things that they are thinking it could be Atlantis.
Okay, from the internet, Marina asks, what might be the purpose of human beings existing with celestial beings? If we are all learning in our existences, why the diversity that is so wide?
Well, I think just what I said. I mean, nature tends to diversify because there are different ranges of consciousness and evolution. Blavatsky says a human being is a stage in evolution, and any entity has to go through what we call human being in any form. Human being is simply, from an esoteric point of view, the stage of evolution where there is self-consciousness. So she says any celestial being that has like a conscious intelligence was a human being in some evolutionary cycle and moved, onward. And any celestial being that has a kind of unconscious intelligence, then they have not been human beings yet. But in that model, there is a progressive expansion of consciousness. So these celestial beings are just a stage in this development of consciousness. And we all need from everybody else. Humanity wouldn't be able to exist if not for the celestial beings and if not for the lower kingdoms. So it's all part of the universe.
How much time do you need to finish up?
I can talk about that in our next talk because, it could fit either here or in the next one. So
okay, all right,
that's fine.
Joe.
If there are questions.
Yes. How do the various celestial beings relate to the various planes of existence?
Well, the idea is that each plane of existence is like their world. And if you are talking about the higher beings, the plane of existence is their body. So, for example, we can say this nature spirit, they live on the etheric plane, which is the subtler counterpart of the physical plane. So that's their world. That's why you don't see them. But if you have etheric sight, then you can see them. So there are some other entities that are on the astral plane, some other entities on the mental plane. And if you develop the ability to see on those planes, you can see them and you can describe them, and they have certain behavior and different degrees of intelligence, and you can interact with them just as you interact with animals, or, you know. So the planes are usually like their world, but when we come to the really high beings that are generally called planetary beings in Theosophy, it looks like the whole plane is their body, in a sense, and their consciousness is pervading the whole plane. So just as our cells, you know, the relationship between the consciousness in our cells and in ourselves.
So another answer to Marina's question of why there's all this diversity is that in order for consciousness to have all these different experiences, they require all these different forms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so the reason is to have all these different experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Besan said once something like that in a different sense, but she said, how could what is infinite manifest in the finite only through infinite forms? You know, so it's a play of words in the sense of whatever is beyond forms will naturally express in a great diversity of forms. And this one consciousness can only experience the world in infinite ways through infinite forms.
Do celestial beings have the ability to project themselves as human beings for short periods of time?
In the Mahatma letters, they say that there are some celestial beings that show a human form. Their form is human-like. You know, many times I wonder why most people, even people that knew about this problem of anthropomorphizing things, why they saw the fairies with a human-like form. But it seems that there are the natural, since the tendency of consciousness is towards the human level, you know, in the consciousness that is developing towards human levels, on the inner planes where form is so malleable, probably that would express with taking a shape similar to human beings. So it could be, you know, it's not unthinkable that these beings that could have any form, they are having a more human form. The other option would be it's just the conditioning of the seer that sees the. But this happens also with people that know about this conditioning and they seem to be beyond that. And then, I don't know, maybe, you know, in the case of higher beings, it's really difficult to talk about how they interact with us. And if we assume that they can interact with us personally, well, maybe, you know, they would assume a human form just because otherwise we would be freaked out by the vision, simply. You know, in the Bhagavad Gita, when Krishna...
That makes me think that since they're higher beings, there's less of a distinction between the individualities in the cosmic consciousness, as it were. And if we all have that spark of that consciousness, then those beings are, in a sense, at that level one with us. And so they can, in a sense, project into our lower conscious what we can conceive of, because we can't conceive of the beings at that level. Mm-hmm. So it's more of, I think personally, that it's more of them projecting from a more abstract sense into a more individual sense.
Yeah, that's very possible.
They could look like bunnies.
I don't know how much credibility you would give to a giant bunny coming and telling you, I want you to be my messenger. You know, if he appears like Jesus, then you say, okay, that's better. But yes, that, you know, reality, as what Ed was saying, you know, reality is relative, what we call reality. And even in other states of consciousness, in what, you know, religions call heaven, that in Theosophy is called Devachan. The idea is that there are the spiritual aspect of people can actually interact with a person that is in Devachan, that has no physical bodies in this state of heaven. And when that spiritual aspect interacts with the person shapes that interaction with the form that he or she knew in life. So all those things are very possible also, yeah.
Well, good interaction tonight. Do you have anything to finish up with? Give us that list.
No, just not the idea that I read that Blavatsky said, you know, a higher being contains lower beings. This higher and lower, take it just as a symbolic way of speaking. But actually the highest hierarchy or the highest beings that are called the primordial seven. Of course, how many would they be in Theosophy? 7 primordial beings that come out of the Logos. All our divine sparks are part of these beings. You know, when in Theosophy we call about the 7 rays of consciousness, that there are different rays or general types of consciousness. Each one of these primordial beings are the ray, and all our divine sparks, all our monads are inside that particular being. So that particular being could be seen as our Father in heaven, you know, and it is said that some mystics perceive this as being an external God, this primordial being. So yeah, we are all inside because there is no inside or outside in the one consciousness. And but as we go more to the periphery of the manifestation, things seem to be more separated. But yeah, keep always in mind. I remember I went once to a talk on Dzogchen. Dzogchen is one discipline or school, if we want to say it that way, within Tibetan Buddhism. And you know, in Buddhism they have this idea of the refuge, I take refuge in the Buddha, in the Sangha, which is the community, in the Dharma, which are the teachings. So this monk, and Dzogchen is very non-dualistic. And this monk said, when we say that we take refuge in the Buddha, and in Tibetan Buddhism there is the idea of Dhyani Buddhas, which are these 7 primordial beings, but they have only 5, so we have more in Theosophy. The idea is that they manifest in different, during the different root races. So we are in the 5th root race, only 5 are manifested, but there are 7. This is the Theosophical idea. But he was saying all these Dhyani Buddhas are in our consciousness. They are not entities out there. That's a very Theosophical idea, because usually the idea is that the Dhyani Buddhas are out there, the Buddha is out there. You know, he said, when we say we take refuge in the Buddhas and the Dhyani Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas, these are aspects of our consciousness. And that was a very, I really liked it, you know, to see it outside also the Theosophical tradition.